Hey everybody, welcome to Black Spring. Now, by now, I'm sure you're all in the throes of the mainstream media reporting yesterday's news today, with featuring our usual suspects, Jim Acosta, quibbling over something that's parallel to "this too shall pass," or "oh, he said it would go away. He said it would go away." Or someone quibbling over Jared Kushner using a pronoun "our" when speaking of stockpile use between federal and states, or the many other issues that come up, or the outrage or the manipulation and projection that you get from the mainstream mediocres. But I won't bore you with those, or how well the president's trajectory is on social distancing or those kinds of things. You can entertain yourself with those. But today I will bring you a story that pretty much sounds like something you've heard before. But we'll begin with what we've quoted many times, and that would be, quote, or paraphrasing, Rahm Emanuel's "never let a crisis go to waste." But this time, it's the UN that's not letting a global crisis go to waste. So in that, I'd like to bring you to our vetted source today, and that would be from the New American. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me here on this segment of Black Spring. And in this segment, we will be taking a look at the article entitled "United Nations Wants 10% of the World's Income to Fight the Pandemic." Now, this is written by James Murphy. Now, avowed socialist and United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has announced the creation of a global fund meant to address the pandemic. He is asking for all nations to contribute the equivalent of 10% of all global GDP to fund a gigantic, quote, human-centered, innovative, and coordinated stimulus package, end quote, which would be administered by a global authority, presumably the UN itself. Quote, "a large-scale, coordinated, and comprehensive multilateral response amounting to at least 10% of global GDP is needed now more than ever. This crisis is truly global. It is in everyone's interest to ensure that developing countries have the best chance of managing this crisis, or the pandemic will risk becoming a long-lasting brake on economic recovery," end quote. The UN report states, quote, "the new pandemic disease is attacking societies at their core, claiming lives and people's livelihoods," end quote, Guterres said. The plan, entitled "Shared Responsibility, Global Solidarity," responding to socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic. We entrust the UN or another globally entity yet to be named with approximately $8.7 trillion, which it would supposedly use to fight and eradicate the pandemic and address other problems that have resulted from the virus. The UN's current budget is approximately $3 billion. The $8.7 trillion would be 2,900 times greater than its current budget. The plan calls for massive global stimulus in order to, quote, "restore confidence in the future," end quote. Quote, "the global nature of the economic shock we are facing, with simultaneous collapses in both supply and demand, calls for the first truly global fiscal stimulus in history," end quote, the plan states. Needless to say, it also calls for massive redistribution of the planet's wealth. Where have you heard that before? Quote, "to be effective, the stimulus package will need to focus on direct and targeted transfer of resources to the most vulnerable households and scaling up wealth, emergency preparedness, social protection, tax abatement, low interest rates, access to credit, insurance, and wage support schemes. Support must be provided to countries that lack capacity to implement these measures," end quote. Among the measures in the plan is to give approximately $100 billion to the World Health Organization, whose Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus was complicit in the spread of the pandemic by continually repeating communist Chinese talking points, including the farcical claim in January that the pandemic was not transmissible to humans. Money from the fund will also be used to pay specific, quote, attended to continue the delivery of sexual reproductive health services such as access to contraceptives without prescription during the crisis, end quote. As, quote, reproductive health services is a globalist euphemism for abortion. The folks at Planned Parenthood should be happy. To Guterres, the Chinese pandemic represents a turning point in human history and a chance to implement the UN's 2030 agenda and also put some teeth in the Paris Climate Accord of 2015. Quote, and when we get past this crisis, we will face a choice to go back to the world we knew before or deal decisively with those issues that make us all unnecessarily vulnerable to this and future crisis. Everything we do during and after this crisis must be with strong focus on building more equal and inclusive societies that are more resilient in the face of pandemics, climate change, and the many other challenges we face, end quote, the plan states. Quote, we already know what we need to do. It is laid out in the global roadmap for the future in the 2030 agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, end quote. The UN is not the only entity to take interest in globalist response to the pandemic. The World Economic Forum has presented a strategic intelligence overview of the pandemic that is so layered, so intricate, so complex that it is hard to believe it could have been created in the scant weeks since the pandemic was declared. An interactive graph details the pandemic impact on financial markets, travel, trade, global workforces, and various healthcare issues such as vaccinations and halting the spread of the disease. It's almost as if the plan pre-existed the Chinese virus, as if the plans were waiting for just the right crisis in order to be unveiled. Guterres and the UN are asking for the entire solar system, perhaps in hopes of being granted the moon, and we have to be vigilant and make certain that they are not granted the moon, or that moon, or even a small asteroid to rule over. Best way to remove the criminal influence of the UN is to remove the United States from its membership role. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in to this segment of Black Spring. And here, for my tag on this call from the UN, first and foremost, the actual title of the actual plan actually very much resembles, if you're not familiar with Nancy Pelosi's Take Responsibility for Families and Workers Act. So pretty much parallels the plan from the UN entitled Shared Responsibility, Global Solidarity, Responding to the Social Economic Impacts of the Pandemic. Pretty close there. And generally, in a previous video, we've discussed the UN 2030 goals. We've also discussed that the UN is broke. And not to mention, last year, President Trump made it clear to the UN General Assembly that the future belonged to patriots and not to globalists. So this is a globalist call for wealth redistribution, social protections, basically pork. They want a pork stimulus to fulfill the UN Agenda 2030. They want to implement that. So do I think that the U.S. is going to give in to any of that? Not with a President Trump-led administration. Now, will there be other schemes and antics to answer the call, or private partnerships, or other foreign entanglements? Yes, I would submit yes. However, these are UN agenda based desires and wants, their wish list. Not to mention the World Health Organization is also pretty much funded and pretty much parented by the UN. So all of these groups that are calling for funding and wanting to extend abortion and options, these are all a part of the UN Agenda 2030. So I will leave a link, of course, in the description box for you to explore. more points of this Sustainable Development Goals, which is not very different from the Democrats' plans for America in 2020. And as always, I'd love to hear your comments, your concerns, and if you could like or unlike, dislike, subscribe, share, hit that bell for notifications. You can help with the suppression of conservative voices. And of course, you can get back to your own trajectory on social distancing, or maybe even deciding whether or not you're going to wear a mask when you go out again. With that said, have a great rest of your Friday and a great weekend.